In the waters off Brooklyn, thousands of Americans died within sight of home. They could see the shoreline and still never made it back. By some estimates, more Americans died in British captivity around New York than were killed in combat during the entire Revolutionary War. And most people have never heard of the ship they called Hell. Welcome back to Dark Chronicles. This is the story of the prison ships of the American Revolution. When Americans picture the Revolution, they picture musket smoke at Lexington, the winter at Valley Forge, maybe the surrender at Yorktown. What they usually do not picture is a harbor. But after George Washington's defeat on Long Island in 1776 and the loss of New York, the British gained control of the single most important city in North America. New York became their military base, their port, their prison, and for thousands of captured Americans, their graveyard. The old rules of war broke down almost immediately. In a war between recognized states, captured soldiers were prisoners of war. In the British view, however, many of the men fighting for independence were not legitimate soldiers at all. They were rebels, traitors, smugglers, or pirates. That distinction mattered. It meant prisoner exchanges were inconsistent, treatment was harsh, and thousands of captured Americans were dumped into a system no one had properly planned for. The first men pushed into that system were not all Continental Army regulars. Some were militiamen taken after the fighting around New York. Some were sailors. Many were privateers. The Armed Seamen Congress had encouraged to attack British shipping. Privateering was one of the few ways the rebels could hurt Britain at sea. It was profitable when it worked, patriotic when it succeeded, and catastrophic when it failed. When the British captured American privateers, they often gave them a choice: swear loyalty to the Crown, join the Royal Navy, or go to prison. As the number of captives grew, British jails and makeshift land prisons filled up. So the British turned to what they had in abundance: worn-out ships. They moored old hulks in Wallabout Bay, a stretch of water off the Brooklyn shore near what would later become the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The names changed over time, but survivor accounts and later records point to a grim little fleet: the Whitby, the Good Hope, the Scorpion, the Falmouth, the Strombolo, and above all, the Jersey. The Jersey had once been a 60-gun warship of the Royal Navy. By the Revolutionary War, she had been stripped of her glory and turned into something far more useful to an occupying army: a floating cage. If you stood on shore and looked out across the bay, the scene would not have looked like one of history's worst prisoner disasters. That is part of why this story disappears so easily. The water was calm. The ships were anchored. No cannons were firing. But inside those hulls, the revolution was still killing people every night. The Jersey was built for war, not for warehousing human beings by the thousand. Yet according to later memorial accounts and many survivor descriptions, well over 1,000 prisoners could be jammed aboard at a time. One later monument text claimed the ship had originally been built to hold about 400 men, but was used to confine roughly 1,400 Americans. Whatever the exact number on any given day, the conditions were catastrophic. Ventilation was terrible. The lower decks were cramped and foul. Food was poor and often insufficient. Water was dirty. Clothes rotted on people's backs. Vermin spread through bedding and beams. Smallpox, dysentery, yellow fever, typhus, and other diseases tore through men already weakened by starvation. The most horrifying detail is how ordinary death became. Accounts from the prison ships describe mornings that began not with reveille but with corpse removal. Historian summaries and later retellings of the Jersey often describe roughly a dozen deaths a night during the worst periods. Some estimates are lower. some higher. But the pattern never changes. Men went below deck sick, and many never came back up. American poet Philip Freneau, who was imprisoned on a British prison ship, wrote about vermin, disease, filth, and the sense that these hulks were places where sorrow itself lived. He helped turn prison ship suffering into patriotic memory. But even patriotic memory had limits. Poetry can preserve outrage. It cannot reproduce the smell, the thirst, or the sound of men dying shoulder to shoulder in the dark. And if the phrase floating death camps sounds too modern or too strong, look at the outcome. These were ships where men were packed into conditions that predictably produced mass death, and everyone involved knew the deaths were continuing. Whether the cause was deliberate cruelty, administrative indifference, or imperial arrogance hardly mattered to the men still trapped inside. The result was the same. Some prisoners could see the shore. That may be the cruelest part of all. Wallabout Bay was not the middle of the Atlantic. It was right there, within sight of land, of homes, of a city under occupation. Freedom looked close enough to imagine, and impossibly far away to reach. And then the dead stopped staying hidden. Bodies from the prison ships were often buried hastily along the Brooklyn shore, or disposed of in ways that left bones and remains to wash back toward land. That is how the harbor itself began to testify. By the end of the war, the story of the prison ships had become impossible to completely suppress. But even then, the exact death toll remained contested. George Washington's Mount Vernon estimates that between 8,000 and 11,000 Americans, and perhaps more, died in British custody in New York. Historian Edwin Burroughs argued the number may have been as high as 15,000. The prison ship Martyrs Monument in Brooklyn honors over 11,500 dead. The exact number matters. But the shape of the disaster matters even more. This was not one isolated atrocity on one isolated ship. It was a years-long humanitarian collapse centered on British-held New York. The Jersey became the symbol because it was the worst-known hulk, the one survivors remembered most vividly. The ship many inmates simply called Hell, but the system was larger than the Jersey. It is also worth saying something honest here. Many historians do not describe the deaths as the result of a formal British extermination policy. Some argue they reflected indifference, incompetence, overcrowding, and the brutal logic of a war in which the British did not initially grant captured Americans normal prisoner of war status. That nuance matters if you care about accuracy. But nuance should not bleach the horror. A government does not need a written policy of extermination to preside over a mass death trap. If commanders know prisoners are starving, diseased and dying in extraordinary numbers, and the system continues for years, moral responsibility does not disappear just because bureaucracy failed before sadism was officially declared. The privateers suffered especially harsh treatment, because the British often viewed them less as honorable enemy sailors than as criminals. Thousands of men who had gone to sea for the patriot cause found themselves caged in a harbor, offered survival in exchange for service to the enemy. Many refused. That refusal is one reason the story deserves to be remembered. These were not just men who died in captivity. Many were men who could have escaped death by switching sides, and did not. When the war ended and the British evacuated New York in November 1783, the prison ships did not leave behind a famous battlefield. They left mudflats, shallow graves, scattered bones, and one of the largest revolutionary burial sites in the country. In the early Republic, remains recovered from the shore were gathered and reburied, though not with the urgency you might expect. Like so many stories centered on prisoners, sailors, laboring men and the anonymous dead, this one drifted to the edge of national memory. The new nation preferred cleaner symbols, but Brooklyn did not entirely forget. In time, memorial efforts led to what stands today in Fort Greene Park, the prison ship Martyrs Monument. Beneath it is a crypt containing fragments of the men who died in Wallabout Bay. The monument is grand, but the fact that it has to exist at all tells you something uncomfortable about the revolution. America remembers glory more easily than suffering. We remember commanders more easily than captives. We remember the Declaration better than the dungeon, and that is why the prison ships matter. They reveal the revolution from below deck, not as a parade of famous founders, but as a test of endurance imposed on people most textbooks barely mention. Sailors, privateers, militiamen, boys, laborers, men who got sick in the dark and never came home. If you want to go deeper after this episode, the best starting point is Edwin G. Burroughs' book Forgotten Patriots, which is exactly what the title says: the untold story of American prisoners during the Revolutionary War. I've also linked a few related resources in the description for the prison ships and the wider war at sea. The American Revolution is usually told as a story of liberty taking shape in speeches, congresses, and battlefields. But liberty also has a negative image, a shadow image. And in New York Harbor, that image was a ship with sealed portholes, foul water, and dying men packed into darkness. If you want to measure what independence cost, do not just look at Yorktown. Look at Wallabout Bay. Look at the men who were offered survival if they would betray the cause and refused. Look at the harbor where a new nation learned that empires do not need to execute you in public if they can simply leave you to rot where everyone can see you and no one can stop it. And maybe that is why this story faded. It is harder to celebrate a revolution when some of its martyrs died not with flags in their hands, but with fever in their lungs, thirst on their tongues, and the shoreline of home right in front of them. If this story deserved to be told, subscribe. There are hundreds more like